The Renault Group is a large global auto manufacturer. They manufacture sedans, SUVs, and vans. They entered the Southeast Asian market more than a decade ago. However, Renault's market share has lagged, and the company is projecting a loss in the region next year. The Renault CEO would like to understand if you can help them turn a profit in the Southeast Asian market next year. How will you structure this?
Thank you. Let me make sure that I understand the situation. Our client is Renault. It's a global automotive manufacturer, and they make sedans, SUVs, and vans. They entered Southeast Asia 10 plus years ago, but market share has lagged, and they're projecting a loss for next year. They would like to turn a profit in the Southeast Asian market next year, and they'd like our help to do that. And you'd like me to structure this problem for them.
That's correct.
I have a few clarifying questions and comments before I structure this problem. What I know about the automotive manufacturing business is that it's complex, it is capital intensive, and it's got a lot of moving parts. It's very complicated because of changing technologies, consumer needs, trends, and so on and so forth. And generally, the competition is intense. I have a question around Renault's product lines. You mentioned that they make sedans, SUVs, and vans. Do they make these for consumers and for businesses?
Yes.
You mentioned that the market share has lagged. Historically, what's the market share been?
It's around 6%.
And you mentioned that Renault is projecting a loss for next year. Could you share with me what that number is?
EBIT is negative $257 million.
Okay. And the question is, can our client turn this into a profit? Let me then ask you, do they have a target in mind?
Let's say EBIT of 500 million.
Thank you. I'd like to make my hypotheses and then I'll build a structure. My hypothesis is that Renault can make $500 million in EBIT next year from a current negative $257 million in the Southeast Asian market. What I'd like to do now is build a structure to test this hypothesis. I'll test my hypotheses in 3 steps. The first step is to understand Renault's situation in detail. Second is to find root causes of why EBIT is projected to be minus $257 million next year. And third, fix the root causes and help Renault make $500 million in EBIT. In the first bucket, I'd like to understand the financials. specifically EBIT, market share, and also understand about the market. Second, I'd like to look at the competition, specifically the leaders and what their behaviors are. Third, I'd like to look at the products. What products are they selling and how are consumers responding to those products? In the second bucket, I'd like to break down EBIT into revenues and costs. A low EBIT could mean low revenues and high costs. As far as revenues go, I'd like to understand product mix, price, volumes, or get to understand revenues by sub-regions. I'd also like to get an understanding of the costs. It could be fixed costs, variable costs, and investment costs. After I analyze the data, I will rank the root causes. And in the third bucket, I'd like to fix each of these root causes and then discuss next steps.
Take a look at this data. What are your insights?
Thank you. Let me take a moment to understand this information. So there are two charts here. The first one is Southeast Asian auto manufacturers market share trend. The y-axis is market share, and the x-axis has past years and a projection for the next year. I can see that Renault has lost market share consistently. However, their market share has stabilized at 6% in the last 4 years. What I can see is the client's market share has declined from 9.2% to 6%, and it seems to have stabilized at 6%. They're in fact even projecting that next year will be 6% market share. However, they've lagged significantly. Competitor A, competitor B, and competitor D have consistently gained market share. One thing I'd like to note is this is the Southeast Asian region, which is a group of diverse countries, and I can see how it's challenging. However, competitor A, B, and D are doing fairly well. I'd like to understand why Renault's market share has lagged, even though their competitors who are overcoming these challenges and outperforming. The second chart is Renault's Southeast Asian EBIT trend. The y-axis is EBIT in billions of dollars, and the x-axis is a timeline going back a few years. So there are a few insights over here. Renault's EBIT has always been negative. However, their EBIT has been improving, even though it's still negative, over the past few years. I think the worst years were Y-7 and Y-6. But from Y-5 onwards, it's been less than negative $2 billion. And next year, they're projecting their highest ever EBIT, even though it's still negative $257 million as discussed. What I'd like to do is deep dive into Renault's next year projections and try to understand what's causing a negative $257 million EBIT. If I quickly go back to my structure, what'll help is revenue information, which is by product or by subregions, and cost information broken down by fixed, variable, and investment costs. Would you have that information?
Why don't you brainstorm why Renault's market share has been consistently low in this market?
For sure. So Renault's market share could have been consistently low in the Southeast Asian market because of internal and external reasons. Internally, there's two areas I'd like to look at: Renault itself and the vehicles and their service. And externally, I'd like to look at the markets or consumers and other manufacturers. As far as Renault goes, it could be that they were focusing on EBIT and not on market share. The other one is lack of loyalty. customers in this region are just not loyal to the brand, to the company. Third one is Renault is not organized to manage such a diverse, complex market. Because as discussed, Southeast Asia is not homogeneous, and that could pose challenges. As far as vehicles go, maybe they're not appealing. Maybe the after sales is not good. Maybe for the B2B business, the sales team is lagging. It could be marketing issues, pricing issues, and maybe they just sell higher-end cars or vehicles. Then I'd like to look at markets and customers. So maybe this consumer doesn't prefer European brands. Maybe they're just confused by the offerings. Maybe their needs are not being met. Their needs could be reliability, low cost of ownership, high mileage, so on and so forth. And maybe there's an issue over there. The fourth area I'd like to look at is other manufacturers. Maybe they're aggressive as far as behaviors go in terms of pricing, in terms of marketing, and in terms of market share. I think maybe that's the variable that they prioritize. Maybe they understand the markets better. Maybe they've been in the market for a long time, and so they have a strong hold on the market, and it's very difficult for a new player to get some market share organically. There could be multiple reasons, but I'd like to prioritize three hypotheses. One is longevity, second is consumer needs, and third is, I think, just a complex market.
Thanks. I'm going to give you some data. How will you proceed?
Thank you. Let me take a moment to understand this information. So this data is clients' financial projections for next year. On the y-axis, there's sales and EBIT figures in billions of dollars. And the other y-axis has EBIT in percentage terms. On the x-axis, there are products. I think the note says sale price per unit. So there are different prices for different products. This data will help me understand why the client's EBIT projections are negative $257 million. And if I look at my structure, I'm looking to understand why the revenues are lower and costs are higher, and then rank the root causes. So this chart tells me that P3 and P4 are causing a lower EBIT projection for the next year. Clearly, P3 is causing a negative $257 million EBIT. Now, if I look at P1 and P2, if P3's EBIT was in line with those two products, let's say it was at 5.5%, it should have been 5.5% of $6 billion, which is roughly 5% is $300 million and 0.5% is $30 million. So that's $330 million. Similarly, if P4 were to perform as well as P1 and P2, the EBIT should be 5.5% of $1 billion, which is $55 million. So if you were to add those two, you'd get $330 million and $55 million. That'd be $385 million of positive EBIT. I'd like to take this opportunity to quickly summarize what we've learned so far. Now, my hypothesis was that our client can find the root cause of why they're projecting an EBIT of negative $257 million, and then also hit a target of positive $500 million EBIT for next year. I'd like to drill down into P3 and understand why the EBIT is so low. Would you have any data regarding that?
We checked with the client and were told that the labor costs are high. Can you brainstorm why that's the case?
Sure. So P3 labor costs are high. Why is that the case? So let's break this down. Labor cost per P3 equals to average labor cost per hour times number of hours it takes to build a P3. So labor cost per P3, which is dollars per P3, equals to average labor cost per hour, which is dollars per hour, times number of hours it takes to build a P3. So hours per P3. So average labor cost per hour, that can be divided into financial and non-financial factors, and number of hours it takes to build a P3 can be divided into car and factory. So average labor cost per hour can be influenced by a few financial factors, which are salary, overhead, bonuses, I would say training expenses. As far as non-financial factors go, average cost can go up if productivity is low, lower quality, so that's a redo of work, lower skilled labor, unionized workforce. It can also be if a client uses more experts and contractors. They generally tend to be more expensive. As far as number of hours it takes to build a P3, that can be divided into car and factory. As far as the car goes, maybe it's very complex in terms of manufacturing, assembly, etc. Maybe there are many models of the same car that are being built. So that can increase the time it takes to build a certain car because you need changeouts. As far as the factory goes, maybe it's inefficient, lacks tech, and in general has low throughput. So the fixed costs get piled up onto fewer models and the EBIT is lower. Given the context of the case, I would say the client is successful building other cars or other vehicles. Maybe there's some specific issue with this vehicle type. So I would prioritize the car as number one, and I'd say the factory is number two. These are my two hypotheses moving forward. Would you have any data regarding this?
Yes. The client compared their data against the benchmark, and they are confident they can meet it. Calculate next year's projected P3 and overall EBIT.
Thank you. I'll just take a moment to understand this information. So this is P3 manufacturing costs versus benchmarks, and the cost categories, which are parts, labor, manufacturing, marketing, and transportation and storage. And we have P3 vehicle cost breakdown in dollars, the associated percentages, and in the last column, we have cost benchmark data. So what this data can tell me is where are cost-cutting opportunities. Additionally, labor costs should be 10% rather than 20%, and marketing and advertising should be 15% as opposed to 20%. And the rest of the costs are within limits. With this data, I can calculate potential cost savings and calculate P3 EBIT and next year's total EBIT. P3 EBIT and Renault EBIT for next year. So at this point, I'd like to quickly summarize and restate my hypotheses. My hypothesis is that the client can meet the $500 million EBIT target if they can cut P3 costs and execute. Just quickly going back to my structure. So now we understand that the issue is P3 because of high labor and marketing costs. And we're trying to understand if we can cut labor and marketing costs and make $500 million in EBIT next year. So I'm going to take a moment to build a structure. So change in EBIT for P3 equals to cost savings per P3 times number of P3s made. So cost savings can come from two areas, that is labor and marketing, times we have to calculate number of P3s. So labor should be 10% and marketing should be 15%. So the cost savings is 40% minus 25%, that's 15%. And we need to calculate 15% off. And the total P3 vehicle cost is 0, 0, 10, 16, 23, 20, 30, 9, 13, 18, 22, 23, $23,000. So 15% of $23,000. Times number of P3. And number of P3, I think we have revenue data and price data, so revenue of P3s divided by price of a P3. So I think revenue was 6 billion divided by P3 is $20,000. So that's 10% is 2300 and 5% is 50. So that's $3,450 times 6 billion by 20,000. That's 300,000 units. So it's 3450 times 300K. That's $1.035 billion. Now P3 EBIT is the difference between this number and the original number. So that's 1.035 minus 900 million, 0.9. 0.9, so that's 531. So the new P3 EBIT is $135 million positive, and new EBIT for next year for Renault is 135 million plus 450 plus 180 plus 13. That's 8, 16, 17. So that's a positive $778 million. So in summary, the EBIT for P3 is $135 million and the EBIT for Renault is $778 million.
Thanks. What would you recommend?
So our client can exceed their target of $500 million EBIT and hit $778 million in EBIT next year by doing two things. Number one, cut their labor costs by 10%. And number two, cut their marketing costs by 5%. As far as next steps go, our client should focus on putting a task force together to execute this and also look into P4 and if they can increase profit margins over there. Thank you.
Thank you.